Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Seth Jones. I'm the president of the Defense and Security Department at CSIS, and I am thrilled to have with us today Christopher Maier. Chris is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict, an office that at one point under Mike Vickers I also worked in. Among his responsibilities are all special operations, irregular warfare, counterterrorism, information operations policy, and a range of other issues, which we will get to. Before that, Chris led the Department of Defense's Defeat ISIS Task Force. He also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Combating Terrorism, and had previously served in various positions within the National Counterterrorism Center and the National Security Council staff as Director for Counterterrorism. He's a native of California, so probably not used to the snow in the Washington, D.C. area, graduate of University of California, Berkeley, and also of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. So Chris, welcome to CSIS. Thanks for coming over.
Seth, thanks for having me, and thanks to CSIS for putting on this event on a snowy Tuesday, I guess it is, here in D.C.
Yeah, great. Well, let me just start off. One of the unfortunate events over the holiday period for the United States was the attack in New Orleans that took place on January 1st, 2025. It was perpetrated by Shamsuddin Jabbar, and there are a number of indications as part of the investigation that he was likely at least inspired by ISIS. We know that from the flag that was captured in his car, the allegiance that he posted to ISIS that he posted on video, and just the general investigation and information the FBI has released. So if we can just start off with that, I mean, can you tell us anything about the specific attack in New Orleans? And then just more broadly, can you put this into some context, the general threat that ISIS poses to the homeland and U.S. interests overseas? And if you want to expand that to the terrorism threat to the U.S. homeland and U.S. interests overseas, that's fine. You can do that as well. So, but just put it in the context of ISIS.
Sure. Yeah. So, unfortunately, a reminder again that the ISIS threat is out there. But I think what has been out in the press is pretty expansive in terms of what we understood to be the motivations and the lone actor mentality that we've seen, unfortunately, in other attacks. And unfortunately, even the tactic of using a vehicle we've unfortunately seen, and goes back to 2010, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula encouraging these sort of opportunistic attacks. So somewhat surprising, obviously, like any attack is, but I think many of the tactics we saw in the overall framing is not something that's that surprising, which is unfortunate, of course, because as a veteran of the counterterrorism environment, we spend a lot of time and a lot of resources trying to focus on preventing these sort of attacks. But I think it goes to your broader question of where we've seen the evolution of the terrorist threat to American citizens over the years, and it's much more that inspired attack or that effort to get at Americans overseas. The 9/11 style attacks, the underwear bomber attacks that were those more directed or even enabled attacks that we've seen maybe in the 2010s don't seem to be something that an ISIS, which is very much on its back foot, or an Al-Qaeda even more on its back foot, can pull off. So they've looked to inspire individuals that already have access, and in some cases over time develop the ideological desire to kill their fellow citizens. And I think the Europeans have experienced this, and certainly this is a good reminder again that it still exists in the United States, despite all the efforts and all the good work overseas. You know, simultaneous with this attack is a tremendous campaign by Central Command to put a lot of pressure on the remnants of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and of course a lot of focus on what the change in the political environment in Syria will mean for potentially ISIS and our longstanding ability to keep that pressure on the core there. So
yeah, and even since the collapse of the Assad regime, we've seen special operations and other forces active in Syria right now to conduct action against ISIS, and Central Command has been pretty public about many of those incidents.
Yes. And I think for the very reason of reminding people, obviously beyond the Homeland attack or well before the New Orleans attack, that there is still an ISIS threat out there. And as part of our global coalition for the Defeat ISIS campaign, we've started to focus more attention on places like West Africa and Central Asia, where we know the threat has metastasized because of the intense pressure in the so-called core of Syria and Iraq. So I think this is something that will persist into the next administration. Certainly that's my expectation, because the threat remains out there overseas, but obviously it manifests in a different way than we've seen in the past in the threat to the homeland and how it actually can be carried out by these groups who are thousands of miles away.
So we started off a little bit talking about ISIS and the counterterrorism threat to the homeland and action that special operations and other actors, U.S. actors, have conducted overseas. But as part of your job and as part of special operations more broadly, there's a lot more activity in addition to just counterterrorism. Some of it is characterized as irregular warfare. And can you tell us a little bit about how do you think about what is irregular warfare? What is it not? Some people, even within the U.S. government, get a little nervous about using the term warfare as part of irregular warfare. It certainly, I don't think, implies that this is just a military activity. There are a range of government agencies well outside of the military that have important roles in various aspects of it, whether it's gray zone, people want to call it gray zone activities, or asymmetric,
right,
or a range of other words. But how do you see irregular warfare? What does it mean to you? And how do you put it in the context of special operations activities?
Yeah, so I think we are a bit saddled by the term warfare, and we're the Department of Defense, so we got to have warfare, but it doesn't translate particularly well. I agree with you, to our interagency colleagues, particularly as we in the department have evolved our very definition of it to be specifically less kinetic. And one of the changes here over the last few years in the unfortunately bureaucratic but necessary process of redefining how we think about it is to come up with a definition that is less about warfare and more about all the other activities that contribute to it. So, the Department of Defense does a lot of other things besides just fight large-scale combat operation type environments, i.e. Great Wars. And so I think a lot of what we're talking about from DoD is how do we contribute to a broader whole of government, or indeed with allies and partners, effort to push back on what we know our adversaries are doing, which is trying to exploit this gray zone space, asymmetric, hybrid, you pick your term, but it's fundamentally blended. And so they're using a lot of techniques that are traditional statecraft, and then other ones that are very much not, and they might be using proxies, they may be using cyber, they may be using recent incidents of dragging anchors across the floor of the Baltic Sea. And I think we have a key role as a Department of Defense in focusing on that, understanding that, and in some cases taking action on that, but oftentimes supporting maybe law enforcement, maybe intel, maybe the diplomats to push back on something that is not an optional thing. It's what our adversaries very much are embracing, because we fundamentally assess that they see a distinct advantage. They think they can push us in areas where we either won't want to escalate or won't be coordinated enough to be able to push back on, and they'll continue to sort of expand that aperture or broaden that gap of the type of activity they can do, with the idea over time of building strategic advantage for themselves. And I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that this is strategic patience on their part, and we have to have the same degree of strategic patience on ours. So fundamentally, this is about what the Department of Defense brings as tools, often not kinetic, primarily not kinetic, to support a whole of government.
What are some examples of that then, not non-kinetic for folks to understand?
Sure. So I'm talking about things like understanding at a basic level what foreign adversaries up to, and potentially providing that sort of network analysis to, it might be law enforcement, might be a foreign government, our kind of classic soft finish agnostic that we've really built over years of counterterrorism. Some of the biggest contributions I would argue that SOF has these days is helping foreign governments to be able to arrest or prosecute or disrupt terrorist networks, and we're applying that directly to the irregular warfare context. I'd also argue that some of the placement and access that SOF brings over years and years of generational relationships with partners brings an ability to operate at a deep level of operational integration with partners. And here we're talking about partners where this isn't academic. We're talking about, Baltics, Scandinavians, others who fundamentally have built in their defense strategic concepts that they're going to have to resist and deal with Russian sabotage in the context of those, or other places like the Philippines, deep experience working with them on counterterrorism that directly translates to our ability to help them now deal with clear malign activity by maritime militias and others sponsored by the PRC in the South China Sea. So those types of activities, some of this we will build to do it unilaterally in the U.S. system, but a lot of this is going to be built to help other parts of the U.S. government jointly, or in other parts of our allies and partners, distinct advantage for us in a combined fashion.
So to try to put a little bit of empirics into the discussion, I wanted to go around the world and touch on a couple of key actors along these lines. There's understandably a lot of focus when it comes to Europe on the conventional war in Ukraine. So people see the Russians conducting the invasion, full-scale invasion in February 2022, although they had been involved in a range of irregular and hybrid activities well before that, starting Crimea, and even before that, frankly, and a whole history of active measures. But a lot of focus on the conventional war in Ukraine. Yet at the same time, there has been some public note, including a range of major papers have highlighted Russian activities perpetrated by organizations like the main intelligence director at the GRU or the SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Agency, in Europe, involved in a whole range of activity from targeting, sabotage against fiber optic cables, or against pipelines, or against depots, including weapons depots, or assassinations or attempted assassinations of individuals, or a range of other covert clandestine activity, funding to political parties, influence campaigns, offensive cyber operations. How do you characterize, at least in this space, below the threshold of conventional war, what the Russians are doing, and how much of a threat does it pose?
Yeah, certainly it's there, and I think that's why we're so focused from Department of Defense on this concept of irregular warfare and the change of it, because this isn't a future thing, it's on us right now. And I think the head of MI5, the head of German intelligence have come out in recent months and said the Russians are doing this to us. I think the way we would look at it is couplefold. First, I think they're probing and looking to see where they might have opportunities to expand or broaden the type of activity that in some cases looks more like nuisance activity or petty crime or very non-strategic activity. But I think, like all things, if there's an opening there, these countries, particularly Russia, China, Iran, are going to look to continue to expand on that activity. And then the second part is they're looking over time, I think, to build some ability of affecting our cognitive psyche. And if they can potentially hold things at risk closer to home in Europe or in some of the countries that they believe are fundamental to the support of Ukraine, I think in their analysis, they see an opportunity over time to chip away at public support, at things that might be more in the political space locally than we would necessarily look at this point forward where we stand. So I think it becomes very corrosive if it's allowed to continue, and what might not seem strategic right now certainly starts to plant the seeds for much larger strategic impacts down the road. And I think this is where we spend a lot of time with our allies talking about the resilience piece and making sure that if something happens that we're able to push back on it, and if something does occur, we're able to bounce back quickly. It's not hard to convince many of the frontline states in NATO who have experienced this historically and are seeing it again. It becomes, in some cases, more challenging for those states that aren't seeing it firsthand, and it might look more like a nuisance. But this is where I think fundamentally, to your earlier question, we see DoD's role as enabling in many cases, but many of the actions to disrupt are going to be law enforcement, Ministry of Interior. They're going to be diplomatic sanctions to push back on these sort of activities. Are not in the first order going to be probably military, but we have an important role to play in understanding it, helping, and in some cases down the road being able to ensure that we built our own resilience against this type of activity.
Yeah, it is interesting. Over the course of 2024, for these reasons, I spent a chunk of time in theater in the European Command Theater area of operations, visiting the Finns, who've got a pretty sophisticated and very thoughtful and long tradition of operating in this space. The Baltic states as well, just because of their proximity and the level of threat. And certainly when the Russians do their full-scale invasion of 2022, they have multiple concerns, both conventional and ones in the irregular space. So there are some sort of interesting lessons that we can see from some of our partners and allies in Europe. But I wonder if I can shift gears to briefly, and we will come back to the implications for U.S. and allied and partner special operations, but I wonder if we can shift to Indo-Pacific. What the Chinese are doing is different from the Russians in many ways. They seem to have a much more notable focus, at least as a percentage of their overall activity, on influence operations, part of what they characterize as the three warfares. So can you tell us, in this irregular space, how active the Chinese are, and what some of the common themes you're seeing come to the surface?
Yeah, I think your characterization is pretty consistent with how we see it. I think frankly, the PRC has more to lose than Russia does. And so in the first instance, if we look across the four adversaries, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, we obviously see all of them collaborating more than we've seen. But I think the PRC is much more discreet in how they support the other elements. The Iranians are very openly sharing drones and all kinds of sophisticated military equipment. We know about North Koreans on the battlefield in Kursk and fighting the Ukrainians and such. I think the PRC in the information space is in first order focused on its domestic population, so it's therefore somewhat careful in that regard. And back to my point, they have a lot to lose. They're economically more intertwined than the other countries aren't under the same degree of sanctions, but I think tend to focus heavily on certain areas, as we know, the Taiwan issue, the South China Sea issue. Yes, we see them in other contexts, but I think even in the Belt and Road, be that Africa, be that South Asia, it's more through actions, maybe with a degree of information associated with it, not the same degree that we see maybe the Russians just out there sort of filling the space with misinformation without really any sense that there's any risk in doing so. So it's a little bit of a basic response to your very, I think, important and probably complicated series of things that are going on. But I think the PRC has the strategic patience approach more so than perhaps we see with, say, the Russians or the Iranians that are under intense military and economic and diplomatic pressure at the moment. So they're seemingly more inclined to be more risk-loving, you might say, in their approach, particularly in the information space.
Yeah, the Russians have had a historical tendency to kill people too, whether it's in Ukrainian defectors in Spain or attempted assassination of former Russian officials in the UK. The Chinese have seemed to tend to be a little more not willing to have those kinds of headline news stories. I wonder if I could come back to then the Middle East, which is, it's probably one area where we have seen more public news about Iranian and Iranian-linked organizations. So Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, active. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the Iranian nexus right now and the threat that the Iranians pose in this irregular space?
So I think the Iranians have been the most overt, even though they intended perhaps not to be, in using proxies to advance their own military and foreign policy objectives. And you've listed off some, but Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iranian-aligned groups, of which there are many in Iraq, all to advance their efforts with some degree of distance that I think they believe at some level gives them the ability to be non-attributable, but is pretty obvious to the casual observer. I think where they are right now is in a bad way. They have definitely come out on the short end of the stick since October 7th, 2023 attack by Hamas. So their Hamas proxy is decimated, Hezbollah decimated. They've lost access to Syria for the most part, which was an area that they relied on heavily for advanced conventional weapon movement to their proxy Hezbollah across Iraq and Syria, of course. And we frankly, I think at this point, are trying to determine exactly how much they'll continue on this proxy-centric strategy because they just have fewer of them. I think our sense is the Houthis, while certainly have been built up by the Iranians, may be less responsive to Iranian direction than some of the other proxies. I mean, that's something that I think we'll have to see over time. And we're starting to see signs in places like Iraq that maybe the influence of Iran has waned a bit as they've prompted some of the players to react to other developments, namely, as you already highlighted, that the Assad regime is no longer in Syria. So maybe the Iranians' ability to influence has gone down, even with some of the regional governments. So I think there's been talk in the press about, does this prompt Iran to move more quickly to a nuclear weapon? Not my job to say, but I think that conversation is a manifestation of the realization that the Iranians' proxies are fewer and farther between, and probably have shown themselves, in most cases, not particularly useful when Iran itself comes under attack from Israel. So it's a different calculus, I think, these days in the Middle East as it relates to Iran. I couldn't tell you exactly what their strategy will be going forward, but certainly the tools they've relied on quite openly, in some cases quite effectively, are not there to the same degree. They've certainly been hollowed out.
So we have gone around the world to some degree. We haven't. I mean, we've touched a little bit on North Korea, but focused on the Russians, Chinese, Iranians. I mean, there are certainly other actors as well. From your vantage point, special operations, low intensity conflict, in this landscape, how do you see the role of special operations? And you can expand it too to other interagency partners. How's that likely to evolve, and how important is this component of competition? And again, I will just say, if you look at the money and the time and effort that even the Department of Defense spends on competition, there is a lot of focus on conventional competition, conventional deterrence, building the triad nuclear capabilities. But as we've just outlined, there's a lot of action just below that threshold of conventional war. So how do you see this evolving, and what role do you think special operations need to have in this landscape?
Yeah, it's really a key question for us as we think about the evolution of special operations. And so I'd start with, as the Department of Defense has evolved, so has SOF evolved with it. Even in the last 4 years with the National Defense Strategy, which certainly set out the 4 adversaries and talked about how we're going to work across the spectrum of conflict. Campaigning, to be frank, was not where we started investment. A lot of what ultimately won in the early budget battles was not efforts at campaigning, it was on crisis and conflict, right? And the department, of course, focuses on war fighting or preparing for war, and that was going to be large-scale combat operations. I think what we've seen evolve over the last few years is the natural tendencies to start broaden the frame to what we said strategically was important to us, which is campaigning, and it being more important perhaps than when we initially started out, of being prepared to fight and win a war or 2 wars or however many wars were put in front of us. And so I think SOF has started to come into the fore again. It's still doing counterterrorism crisis response. Those have been the persistent missions, but increasingly where we can support other elements, largely in a support role, for those strategic competition elements. And here campaigning is the bread and butter of SOF. So when we talk about the integration of technology in a way that advances not only our ability to operate, but often provides many of the fixes that we're struggling with as an overall force, we talk about that as solving the challenges of the joint force. SOF plays a big role in that. That could be in some of the more, in vogue elements like AI or man-machine learning. We're doing that at a level that brings operators and technologists together quite effectively. But it could be in some of the old traditional ways of being that sensor out there and providing the necessary input to decision makers to better understand a situation. We're still in 80 plus countries as a special operations enterprise, and most cases that's small numbers. These are not quote unquote the door kickers or operators. These are often individuals operating in conjunction with our embassy or with the partner force, and those generational relationships become really the currency by which we have a broader understanding as a department of what's going on in any number of places, some of which we've talked about, some of which are far afield from there. And so it's really, as I often think of it, a point of continuity with counterterrorism and crisis response for SOF, but also change insofar as we're going back to the proverbial roots of supporting the joint force with some of the hardest problems against peer adversaries or semi-peer adversaries. So lots more emphasis these days in our senior leadership amongst SOF as we talk about it on the PRC, as a pacing threat, on Russia, as we're supporting those efforts across the joint force. And I think that is some of what we've attempted to put out there more publicly as well, because it's incredibly important, I think, for people to understand that SOF is not only the CT force that it did so admirably at for now almost 25 years. Obviously, it's the crisis response force, and it will continue to be so. But we think we have a distinct role, and increasingly are showing that in some of our internal departmental studies and departmental exercises.
It is interesting when you look at the emergence of SOF. I mean, there clearly were, during World War II, for example, you had the Jedburgh teams, which went behind German lines as part of, at that point, OSS operations. But when you look at the emergence of SOF, they played such a critical role in the Cold War in countering Soviet actions in multiple locations. And what I always find interesting is people tend to forget historically that while the Soviets did present a major conventional and certainly nuclear threat to the United States, including the concerns about the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact pushing through the Fulda Gap in the inter-German border, that deterrence held, conventional and nuclear deterrence held, but competition then was pushed down below the threshold. And we saw that occur throughout Latin America, El Salvador, Guatemala. We saw it in Africa. We saw it in Asia. We saw it in the Middle East, and even in Europe to some degree. And that became the birth of U.S. Special Operations Command. The Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations played a critical role in countering Soviet activity, Soviet-backed governments, or the attempt to overthrow governments in a range of places overseas. So how much of that historical aspect do you see as we get increasingly involved in competition with some major powers? How much of that do you see, likely in various forms to resurface the role of special operations to counter Russian or Chinese activity in Africa or potentially Latin America? How much of that history is relevant to the next several years in competition?
I think it's very relevant, and I think some of the cases you've cited are really reinforcing to us the role in special operations that we will have to play. The differences, I think, here are some of the fundamental changes in adversaries' ability to access technology, use different types of techniques than maybe we saw in the Cold War. the barriers are to entry for fairly sophisticated munitions or disruptive techniques and disruptive materiel is pretty low. And I think we will be challenged at times to understand if this is a state actor or a non-state actor, or a non-state actor working on behalf of a state. And then I think we certainly have emphasized with our special operations leaders that we need to be in support of the joint force. So, where we might have been the supported command in the lead for much of the counterterrorism fights, there's aspects of that where we will still be in the lead for CT, but in many cases, it's going to be the joint force that's in the lead, or increasingly coming back to this theme of irregular warfare, other parts of our government that are in the lead. We may have a finish that is ultimately a law enforcement finish by a host government or even our own government, or disruption that might be sanctions against a particular individual or network. And we should be the ones working in the background to illuminate a lot of that using the tools and expertise we have. But it may not be a traditional military or soft finish there. And that, I think, is the role we're going to have to play. And the silent warrior of the past, I think, is very much in tune with that approach going forward in many instances. Sure, there'll be opportunities and probably we'll be called on to do more of the direct action that have been more the calling card oftentimes in the, at least the public discourse of SOF in the CT fights. I don't think that's going to be the future bulk of our effort, and I think we will be enabling lots of other aspects of the government and hopefully partners and allies to be that more visible face. Back to my point earlier of, finish agnostic of how you ultimately get to the disruption, but understanding that we need to be involved in a lot of the places where we're going to need to be disrupting networks that we fundamentally understand because we operate in those areas. We have the generational relationships of allies and partners, and we just have an irregular warfare mindset. So we're able to recognize perhaps more clearly, because we're investing in it, where adversaries are using those techniques.
So you mentioned this earlier, and I want to try to spend a little bit more time unpacking it, which is some of the capabilities that we see countries like China and Russia are developing, not just in the irregular space, but you mentioned some of them, but the sensors, the ISR collection capabilities, space, and even counter space capabilities, if they can disrupt GPS or others, signals intelligence collection, autonomous, unmanned, uncrewed systems, air, surface, subsurface, land-based. And even if we see the Chinese begin to really make progress on quantum, which has some implications for both intelligence and counterintelligence, what is, as you look over the next three to 5 years or so, what challenge does that pose for special operations operating in these areas? I mean, it strikes me part of the challenge with SOF is this hiding and finding mixture. You're trying to hide. There are some indications that's going to become a lot tougher in ubiquitous environments. So what are the challenges, and how do you operate in an environment where some states are going to be able to see you much better than you have in the past? And I mean, that does raise questions about denial and deception in those environments. But how do you think about that?
It is a very important challenge, I think, and there aren't clear answers that I think are going to be immediately implemented. But what I can tell you is, and I think we've seen this in sort of a microcosm of the Ukraine fight, it's going to be more about dealing with being seen and what that means in terms of your signature, as opposed to maybe a previous way of thinking of being not seen at all. And so I think there's, as we talk about this often in the multi-domains we're going to have to operate, it means having the right, if you will, footprint in the digital environment. It means knowing that if an adversary can see you, that you're not something that necessarily generates any more interest. I mean, the fascinating thing looking at some of our less sophisticated adversaries, particularly in some of the areas, is they almost all have social media presence, right? Things that we wouldn't have thought about 15, 20 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago. And that means there's a lot of chaff out there. And I think finding ways to use that noise, sort of security through obscurity, is going to be how we have to think about this. A lot of effort to really build, in many cases, the technology, but oftentimes it's the different thinking, the different tactics, techniques, and procedures that we're going to have to use against adversaries that, let's face it, China, Russia, Iran are much more sophisticated in identifying our activity than ISIS and Al-Qaeda were. And so we've known that for a long time. There's a lot of emphasis and a lot of investment in that space. And I think what I can talk about here is really thinking about it in a different way than just assuming we're always going to have the advantage, and that some of these capabilities that are so ubiquitous now, as you said, and so easy to access aren't going to be threats to us. They are. And it's less of the perfect widget or the perfect way of doing things and more of, I think, a series of layering approaches we're going to have to take. And we've seen some good success in our internal departmental experimentation, that if we really put a lot of emphasis on it, we can achieve degrees of obscurity that I think we're going to need, not only in, if you will, sort of steady state or campaigning, but certainly in cases where we're going to need a period of uncontested space in a crisis or conflict to do the things we need to do.
So part of the toolkit that you've mentioned does include access to various types of technologies and capabilities. What is your sense about where the special operations community is in identifying and then leveraging some of the advances we're seeing in the commercial sector, not just in the United States, but in at least allied and partner countries? People often think of just hardware, but there's a software component to it as well. There's large language models, which may be quite helpful on the information space. There's biotech. There are advances in batteries that can be critical for special operations forces. The whole counter UAS, or countering any kind of unmanned or uncrewed systems. What's your sense about where the special operations community is at in leveraging the commercial sector in some of these areas? Where do you probably need to get better at, or quicker in getting stuff out to the warfighter in the field?
Yeah. So this is definitely an area of prioritization for us, and I know certainly just talked this morning to General Fenton about this very issue, as we're continuing to try to stress the system that is still fundamentally built on a previous model. You might call it the hardware model. We moved to the software space. And despite the fact that SOF often is thought of as finding ways to be more innovative, we still have all the same authorities that the rest of the department does, and the same constraints on procurement, working with commercial vendors and such. And I think where we have had a distinct advantage over time is having a much tighter link between operators and those that are part of the acquisition world to actually more quickly turn on things that work and don't work. One of the things that Ukraine experience has been just phenomenal for, particularly for some of our allies, is prompting them to innovate on certain types of capabilities that they then gift to the Ukrainians or use for themselves far more faster, because it's having to work at the speed of war. We're endeavoring to do that, and we're endeavoring to continue to reinforce the idea that this is operator-led, as opposed to spending a lot of time developing a requirement, then it goes out for bid, and we're shooting a couple ducks behind the duck we're trying to hit. I do worry, though, that some of the structures are built on a previous model, and you can only evolve them so much, and we're going to have to find ways to do things differently. One of the areas I'd highlight that is interesting, talking to some of the graybeards out there, is you talk to them, they said, well, I never spent any time talking to industry because that was a dangerous thing, and I was going to see my career called into question. We've got to be thinking the reverse here, and we've got to do it with the necessary safeguards, but we want our operators who are seeing the problem up front or talking closely to their allies and partners who might be dealing with the problem to be sitting side by side with industry or the right parts of the commercial sector to build solutions we always pride ourselves from the special operations world of being those pathfinders. We're going to have to make sure that we're not believing our own sort of win themes in that we're not believing the hype, and showing that we're actually providing capabilities that then the joint force can take, maybe make a program of record, maybe scale up and use. Otherwise, if we're only doing it for soft, that's not going to be effective. And if we're doing it too slowly to even help the joint force, that's also not going to be effective. And I think that applies across the range of activities. Your earlier question about how we're going to operate in environments that are contested from a surveillance perspective, a lot of this is going to have to be soft, working closely with the intelligence community to come up with those solutions. It's not only about the next widget per se, or the next first-person viewer drone that's going to be something that we produce. It's going to have to be some of these tools that enable us to have that security wrapper around the things that are necessary for us to operate in semi or totally contested environments.
I mean, it does strike me, and you mentioned Ukraine, it does strike me that the speed with which warfare is happening means that there is a greater need now than maybe several years ago to move on acquisitions. I mean, there's this famous, actually talks about it in his book, where former Secretary of Defense, former U.S. Secretary of Defense notes that there's this peacetime mindset within the Department of Defense. If you look at Ukraine, the back and forth, even on electronic warfare, or EW, and drones, or unmanned aircraft systems, has meant that there is a great need to be moving fast in developing technologies or software to use. How much of this, from your perspective, is a cultural mindset? How much of this is actually having to change the way acquisitions and contracting is done? I mean, the special operations community, I think most combatant commands would love to have the science and technology element that SOCOM does. So there are some advantages that you have that other places within the military don't necessarily have. But you still share some of the same challenges. How much of this is trying to figure out how to speed up the acquisitions and contracting processes itself?
It is some of that, because, as I said, we still operate in SOCOM across the SOF enterprise with the same rules. There is no special waiver or carve-out for SOF. But if you think of how unique SOCOM is as a combatant command, with both operational responsibility as a Title X combatant command, but also a service-like piece of having its own acquisition, technology, and logistics shop, science and technology you mentioned, that's really in the organized train and equip business, is unique across all the combatant commands. So you've got your operators who are supporting the other combatant commands around the world with all these missions that often require a degree of precision and discretion, with, in essence, their own in-house ability to do acquisition procurement, whereas others have to go to the services to get that. And so there's the ingredients of being an engine that can overcome some of the inherent challenges that we're all going to confront as a Department of Defense or U.S. government. I think where we probably need to do more, and I hold myself somewhat responsible for not having tried more of this, is some of these pilot efforts, some of these areas where you can create a mini incubator where maybe you have money that is more flexible in a small amount to see.
You don't need a program of record.
You don't need a program of record. And where we get nervous, and when I look at our special operations budget every year, I get nervous is when we're starting to do larger procurements. And those are very much not what has been the DNA of SOF.
Yep.
And I think there's a reason for that. But our real comparative advantages on these smaller efforts get things started. In-house within SOLIC, we don't talk about it that much, but it's very important, a Irregular Warfare Technical Support Division that does a lot of fast fielding, does a lot of work in areas that are very relevant, like subterranean and counter small UXS and UXS, very instrumental in helping some of our allies and partners, because they're taking concepts, putting it on contract and getting it out quickly. And it's a little microcosm, works closely with SOCOM, but a little microcosm of the SOF approach. That by itself, though, if you will, the hustle and innovation, I don't think is going to be sufficient to overcome some of the inherent slowness of the system. It's not because people aren't working on it, it's just because we're built to a different frame, and often not talked about, but very important. Congress likes certain things the way they go that may not be totally responsive to a warfighting or a speed of innovation environment. We talk to them all the time about that, but I think that's another part that's going to have to change over time. Money's going to have to be allocated differently. There's going to have to be more flexibility, or we will continue to build things on a year in, year out basis against requirements that were developed years earlier. Well, unfortunately, our adversaries are doing things that are perhaps more innovative and faster because being authoritarian systems, they can do things differently. At the end of the day, we're going to do better when the field is level, or we just have higher quality people and the technology is much more sophisticated, but we need to make sure that we're doing what I think SOF has often done quite well, which is take the operator who knows the problem with the person who can fix it, be that a coder or somebody who's going to build something, put them together, come up with something that gets started, and then start innovating to the point where you've got a solution that works at the speed of war, or the speed of campaigning, or the speed of an adversary's attempt to threaten you, and you're trying to plug that gap.
So you mentioned the subject of budget and money. I do have to ask, and this is a bit of a pet peeve of mine too, is we have talked a lot about the irregular warfare landscape and activities that the Russians, Chinese, Iranians, and other countries are doing, and the collaboration that they're conducting. We talked also a little bit about the history, even during the Cold War, of Soviet action at the height of sort of big superpower confrontation, and the important role that SOF have played. There's been a fair amount of criticism of the SOF budget as being pretty low, and some SOF, including in the Army, being cut. What is your sense about, do we have the right budget or numbers? I know it's not just about that too. Sure. There's a readiness and a capability and other factors, but what is your sense about whether we've got, we're in the ballpark for numbers and budget and things like that?
Yeah, I think we always talk about in this context, the SOF budget has been flat for a number of years. One of the things I've learned, one of my primary takeaways in this job over about the last 4 years, is how much the services are supporting SOF is an element that's not often talked about, but is incredibly instrumental. So, the SOF budget, about $14 billion, once you start to add in other things. If that's $14 billion by itself, just SOF having to do sort of, if you will, the full extent of the things that we're asked to do, that's not going to be sufficient. What we benefited from over the years, particularly in the CT fights, was a lot of help from the services on all those, if you will, enablers, all the additional capabilities people. As the services are being asked to do more with the same amount, or in some cases less, and increasingly are looking at a very complex world, they're spending less time on balance supporting SOF. So this is why we talk all the time about, hey, SOF, if you're naval special warfare, you need to be very much integrated in the Navy and helping solve their problems, providing solutions. Marine Special Operations, Army, Air Force, obviously, goes on and on. I think, I've been open about supporting the decision at the end of the day to reduce the number through the process we went through of SOF end strength. But I think if you look at it holistically, we're going to need more of the things that we ultimately had to cut. We cut psychological operations, we cut civil affairs, we cut those intelligence, other folks that unfortunately we often call enablers, but increasingly are more and more important relative to operators, because they're the ones that help us understand not only what the environment is, but the effects we're having. Yeah. And so those are the same people that are in great demand with the combatant commands, the services, in fact, the entire interagency. So it's not surprising that we're short on those folks. And, ultimately at the end of the day, we were able to reduce some of the billets that were unfilled, but they're unfilled because those people are hard to actually acquire and you can't build them fast enough. So I provide less of a not enough, too much answer, because I think it's important to think of it in the overall ecosystem of what is actually helping the the three kind of core soft missions as we talked about: crisis response, counterterrorism, and then the elements of SOF that go to integrated deterrence or the counter adversary aspects that SOF is uniquely positioned to provide. And I would argue that from a kind of global functional perspective, some of our fellow travelers like Cybercom, like Space Com and Space Force suffer some of the same challenges we do about, is their budget big enough or too big or right-sized? It's also about what they can draw on from the bigger department that ultimately, I think, helps to answer that question more holistically.
And for you, that's the Army, that's the Navy,
Absolutely.
That's the Marine Corps to some degree, Air Force, all
Sure.
of which have an important role in and elements of SOF within them. Last question for you is, as you look back on your time as the Assistant Secretary for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict, what would you say maybe the one or two most significant successes out in the field have been? Has it been some of the work that was done in Ukraine to aid? Has it been strengthening resilience in Taiwan, supporting some of the frontline NATO states, Baltics or others? What have been the one or two most, you think, successful efforts of Special Operations Forces since you've been in the job?
Yeah, I would say certainly in a public context, one of the most successful has been our ability to continue to support, in some cases lead, the counterterrorism fight. At the same time, we've been called on to respond to historically high numbers of crises, be that the embassy military assisted departure in Khartoum, Sudan, lots of preparation for various different Middle East scenarios, and at the same time increasingly become a key player on the national defense strategy for adversary problem set we often shorthand as integrated deterrence. So one of the things from the SOLIC perspective that I often think we've done well on and talk to my team about is the strengthening of SOLIC was largely about the counterterrorism fight, and was special operations lacking civilian oversight that was strong enough, and that certainly was relevant at the time. I would argue now it's been helping SOF really navigate to be more effective in those NDS type fights. So against China, against Russia, yes, there was activity underway, but we've been able to, back to some of your earlier questions, been able to move very rapidly as a force to support the joint force on those efforts. Resilience in Taiwan, yes. Being prepared to take the relationships we had in Ukraine and in some cases hand those to other partners, in other cases really reinforce those to ensure the Ukrainians had more capability than they would have had we not been there ahead of time. And a lot of that has, I would say, been facilitated by the ability to not only rely on the special operations enterprise to move rapidly, but us in SOLIC to help strategically really guide the way on how to get there. And I think at the end of the day, it's really, to answer your question, at its core, it's been our ability to do all those things you said simultaneously while undergoing a flat budget, while undergoing force reductions. And it shows, I think, the degree of resilience, but also the flexibility of the special operations enterprise. And really at the end of the day, SOF is often in the lead for irregular warfare. That's not because that's the final way we want it to be, but because the ability to think in sort of irregular ways and towards bringing solutions to near-term problems and being cognizant of some of those gray zone activities, perhaps more so than other parts of the joint force are, because it's in our DNA and it's what we're supposed to be doing.
Well, and the last comment as I wrap up is it is first of all such a pleasure having you here at CSIS. Second, one of the great things about our special operations community that I have witnessed many times over the years is how willing they are to take all these actions and not be the face of this, but to work by, with, and through partners and allies across the globe. So how much of that is done without necessarily being seen. So thanks so much for all the time you spent. What probably not a lot of people know about you is how much you've spent time across various administrations. So thanks for your great bipartisan work over the years to protect the nation. Really appreciate everything you've done, and thanks for coming over today.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for entertaining this conversation, which I think is really important. I'm glad you created the forum to do this, and it's always great to see you. And thanks for your questions.
Thanks.